Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 17 preview as we look ahead towards a pretty calamitous week for managers. Of course, the Erling Haaland injury is probably the sort of biggest pressing point in terms of what to do with our teams and how to sort of address that. So I think that's obviously going to be the first question that I answer. But then generally, I also think that there is an answer to that question where you might just be rolling, keeping Holland in your team as well. And then we'll be able to talk about midfield transfers, defender transfers, and of course, alternative forward transfers in such a situation. Again, I'm also going to be talking about captaincy for this video, so do stay tuned for that. But I think the captaincy obviously will be coming with the proviso that Holland is expected to be out for this game. That's just based on what we've sort of inferred from Pep's press conferences. So let's just quickly get started with the Holland news and really the question of what to do with him and sort of what forwards we have available. Personally, I think just reading what Pep has said so far, you can clearly sort of suggest or maybe infer that Crystal Palace seems too soon for Erling Haaland, and it's more likely that he's actually going to be back for Everton away. Now, as I've been saying, Everton is definitely a tough fixture now. I think whatever sort of big team goes towards Everton, unless let's say Ashley Young gets an early red card, you're going to expect a tough match. That's probably what City are going to face. And in that sort of context, I think given that maybe Holland is a little bit uncertain for that game as well, depending on how he, for example, recovers from this sort of injury, the issue, I suppose, is whether it actually makes sense to go out of Holland in general. I think there's two answers as well, and it really depends as well on your free transfers available. If you've got two free transfers, I think this is the perfect time to simply jump out of Holland. You have two transfers really available to you. Alvarez, who of course is the best like-for-like replacement of Holland. And the reason why I say this is because obviously as soon as Holland is gone, Alvarez becomes the penalty taker, and that just makes him an amazing pick in FPL. It also just means that his position in the team is probably a little bit more secure and the minutes will be fantastic. However, obviously, there is still going to be a blank Game Week 18, so that is a genuine point to concern. However, obviously, if you can get through blank Game Week 18 and your team still looks relatively good, let's say you're on a 3-4-3 structure right now, then actually moving towards Alvarez is probably not going to hurt your team too much for Game Week 18. And in the meantime, you can probably benefit in the short term. And let's say if Holland actually misses out on the Everton fixture, you have, for example, a little bit of a steroided Julian Alvarez. On the other hand, I think if you're looking for a safe, simple transfer, there's nothing better really than Dominic Solanke. Dominic Solanke is fantastic for two reasons. I think the fixture run is very similar to Newcastle, first of all. If you kind of look at it as in three good games and three bad games, I think that's exactly what Bournemouth have in store for them. Luton Town at home is a perfect sort of landing point to jump onto Solanke, and it probably also saves you a little bit of money. What I actually think as well when we think about Asian Cup and AFCON is all these players will be leaving our teams on Game Week 21. And ideally, of course, the team structure that we'll be heading towards is probably going to be a 3-4-3 of some sort, right? Where maybe we own, let's say, Holland around that time, but then we're also looking for two forwards. And those two forwards are probably going to be Watkins plus another forward. And then that question is going to be, is it Solanke? Is it Darwin? Or is it Alvarez? I think when we speak about, in the distant future and Game Week 21 and beyond, what would be interesting is that Darwin could very well be the Liverpool penalty taker, and his minutes, of course, would be very, very good. Now, of course, the poor finishing aside, I think you also have to sort of take into the context that, Solanke is a perfectly good option, but how much money are you really spending in certain positions? So the question really could be, if you have so much money available and at your disposal, I suppose the question is KDB back or is Madison back? These are the only two players, and maybe Fernandes as well, where you can generally think about, okay, that's where our midfield money is going to be spent on. But if you have cash left over, I think it's very, very viable that we do own, for example, Holland plus Watkins plus even Alvarez, who's a little bit more expensive than Solanke. So that's a question that you're going to kind of have to ask yourself then. But I think in the short term, Solanke is a perfect transfer for this week. And alternatively, Raul Jimenez is an interesting option in terms of if you really, really, really want to cut down your budget. Because what Jimenez brings to the table, of course, is someone at 5.2 who is at sort of a ridiculous price. What we previously had is someone like Dominic Calvert-Lewin, who at 5.8 starts most of these games for Everton, but still with his sort of fitness is someone who is an early substitute. So that's my concern. And so you're spending money on someone who's very close to Solanke's price, if we're being honest, who doesn't play the same minutes as Solanke, and ultimately, has worse fixtures. I think if we look at Everton's fixtures, obviously Everton are probably one of the actual sort of top half teams if we actually look at, for example, team strength. But the fixtures are still very tough. Now, having said that, obviously some Everton players have done incredibly. They've gotten 2 clean sheets with tough teams, Chelsea and Newcastle, for example, although some people might say that Chelsea's not really a tough team or that Newcastle away isn't a tough team. But that's the reality, right? Contextually, I think we would say these two teams are top teams, and Everton have gotten some great results as of late. As someone who used to own Jordan Pickford and had no clean sheets from him, I'm pretty salty about it. But you can see, of course, Everton's a very, very good team. So Calvert-Lewin's also an interesting one too. I just think it's a weird sort of jumping on point because their fixtures do feel a little bit average compared to, let's say, Solanke's. So I like Jimenez in the sense that if you're thinking about someone who's going to cover game week 18 for you and allow you to, for example, persist in a very, very light 8 attacker setup, then I think Raul Jimenez is sort of perfect for that. As far as the midfield transfers for this week, I think it's a little bit more interesting because right now we're in a landscape where I would say, of course, Chelsea have a great fixture run of games, but our confidence in Chelsea might not be, high enough to say we want to go double Chelsea attack. So if you already own Palmer, I think there's no need to go into Palmer again in the sense that you're going for Palmer plus Sterling. So I would probably just persist with just Palmer for now and probably not waste a midfield spot on Sterling for the time being, given that also both Palmer and Sterling are both yellow card threats. So if you actually double up on these Chelsea players, you're sort of adding a little bit too much risk in your team, in my opinion. Both two players who could be suspended, depending on when that yellow card drops. So what I actually like right now is actually the idea of Richarlison. And obviously Richarlison is someone that I'm not just reacting to purely because of the brace. If you guys remember from my wild card, I actually did take a 2 game week punt on Richarlison, and we're sort of met with the same situation again. Richarlison's back in the team. He's very likely going to start in the future. And what's even better about Richarlison now is Maddison's injury seems to be a little bit longer than we expected. He's probably going to be back in February, which is what I've heard, even though he's mentioned himself with an interview with Ben Foster that he's been progressing well. However, one thing that's key that we should mention is if you own Richarlison now and sort of own him all the way towards, let's say, the Asian Cup period, when Son is actually out of this Tottenham team, Richarlison's going to be the penalty taker of this team. That's probably my assumption. I'd say probably 80% that that's going to be the case. There are no real penalty takers who are actually putting him at threat. So therefore, I think Richarlison's just a fantastic punt to go into. Given that we probably own, let's say, only maximally two Spurs players, let's say one fullback plus Son right now, it's very easy to triple up a Richarlison, and I think it's perfectly fine. And you can also look at that position where Son, of course, is going to leave FPL, and maybe later on we can actually just bring Son back into our team, and nothing will really change. So I think Richarlison's a very, very good pick. Another good pick as well, in my opinion, is going to be Gordon. Obviously, Gordon is someone that we've mentioned time and time again. I don't think I necessarily need to go into the details as to why Gordon's a good pick. I think, generally speaking, yes, of course, Barnes is back, but Gordon is probably, in my opinion, the priority attacker that will play the most minutes when it's reasonable, right? So, for example, he was an early substitute in the Tottenham game, but I think you have to look at the sort of position that Newcastle were in. I don't think that Eddie Howe reasonably thought that the Newcastle team had a chance to really fight in that game. So it made sense to actually rest some of the key players where possible, given that the Champions League game at stake in this midweek fixture is so important for Newcastle's season. So I do think Eddie Howe actually abandoned that game. We've seen also that Gordon, for example, in more competitive games, actually moved towards the right wing or moved into a centre forward position. Now, with Isaac and Wilson both fit, technically fit at least, that's probably not going to give Gordon too many extra minutes in the center forward position, but definitely because I would say Matt Ritchie is clearly a step below, let's say, both Almiron and Gordon. There's very good prospects for Gordon to still have good minutes, so I wouldn't be overly concerned about the early substitution. I still think Gordon's a very, very, very good pick going forwards. So those are your midfield options for this week when you're looking at transfers. I think when we're talking about players like Hwang or when we're talking about players like Bowen, I mean, I like these players, but I still think Bowen, for example, is playing for a very, very weak team, and I do think that his underlying stats so far have been a little bit overstated. And I also think he's been a bit fortunate this season. He's actually one of the top overperformers. So is Hwang, and that's why I mentioned these two players in that category, because the three leading overperformers this season in terms of goals versus expected goals is actually Son, Hwang, and Bowen. And there's only one player within that list where we can generally say that player is a proven overperformer of finishing and probably one of the best finishers that we've seen, at least in recent memory, and that's going to be Heung-min Son. So no surprise there to have Son there. I think that's something we expect. Whereas Bowen, for example, I can easily mention that in the previous season, he had actually underperformed his sort of goal scoring by around 3.4 goals, right? So suggests that Bowen actually isn't someone that we should just generally look at, right, as someone who's a very, very clinical finisher. He's obviously been a clinical this season, and he's been in great positions. He's also benefited, for example, from some ridiculous deflection goals, like the Aston Villa one that was given. So I think in that sort of context, we sort of have to just pause a little bit and just think about how expensive Bowen is in the midfield landscape, and just think maybe we can actually spend our funds a little bit better. With Hwang, I think the issue simply is 4 yellow cards plus Asian Cup, and that's too much of a risk, and the two best fixtures have actually gone. So the last pick is going to be the defenders, and what to do with the defenders. I think in the defender position, we actually have, once again, very, very similar transfers to the past. This week is actually quite beneficial for Arsenal defense once again. I think I would definitely, if I've been keeping these Arsenal defenders, I would just play them here. I would not look at, for example, Game Week 17 as a good time to jump off the Arsenal defense. If anything, if you want to jump off the Arsenal defense, I think the best time to do so would be on Game Week 18. You probably keep them for Game Week 17. Now, in terms of investing into a Chelsea defender, I think Colwill is still the best pick to go for. We saw, for example, that Thiago Silva can actually be rested, and Colwill was rested as well. However, James got injured, and that probably just means if we're thinking about the fullback positions, I know Malo Gusto's back in training, but it's very, very likely, in my opinion, that Colwill will get the start versus Sheffield United home, and that's really what you want when you're bringing in a Chelsea defender. I think his minutes should be quite secure, especially because of the James injury. I would not be recommending Colwill if James didn't get injured. But that has, for example, made it so that it's a lot easier for Colwill to play a lot of minutes in this easy run of games. And I think that's perfect for Colwill. Other Chelsea defenders I'd probably not jump into. I really like Thiago Silva's minutes so far, even though he got the rest in the previous game. But my issue is that at 5.0, considering that Chelsea aren't a particularly great defensive team, as it stands. Obviously, easy fixtures will probably change our opinion on Chelsea as a team, but I'm not really sure why I'd want to spend that much money on Thiago Silva for now. So moving on to other defender options, I think we have some interesting choices. Ironically, I think you could maybe think about going into one of the Bournemouth defenders, because Bournemouth obviously are a team that are actually surging, and you have a perfect fixture here where it's effectively a chance to go into either Senesi or Zabarni, right? Two players who actually are below 4.5 million and actually have a really good fixture in Game Week 17. And when we think about Game Week 18, not too bad of a fixture for Bournemouth standards. But still, I think my concern really with some of the Bournemouth defenders is that ultimately, how often are you to play them? And would you not be better off with, for example, just having, let's say, a complete dead spot in, let's say, getting Taylor in your team, for example, and just saving up money there? Or would you actually prefer, let's say, owning someone from a top half defense? Because I think definitely Bournemouth have changed in terms of our expectations from the attacking point of view, but I'd still say their defense is probably something that we need to consider maybe is not that good still, even though the results have been fantastic. So that's what I would say. And in terms of obviously just the generic Spurs transfer, I've been obviously peddling Porro for weeks, but clearly Udogie is going to be still a good option. A lot of people will just be looking at the goal and thinking Udogie might be a better option than Porro. I still think that what Porro brings to the table is far standout of what Udogie does. Now, obviously, I'm saying this after knowing that Udogie basically was in, a tap-in position. So, one of the best positions that you could ever find your fullback in. But I would probably compare that, for example, to the Andy Robertson versus Trent dilemma. Andy Robertson has, moved into a lot of great goal scoring positions, almost as if he was a centre forward at times. But Trent, for me, always has that, for example, bag of goods where you got free kicks, you got set pieces, so many other things that actually make Trent so good. And I think that's what Porro brings to the table, even in open play. Look at that, for example, perfect cross to Richarlison. He's done a lot of things this season in terms of, for example, attempts on goal and previously as well. If you look at his, for example, performances last season too, but also just, going back to when he was in the Portuguese league with Sporting, that's full bag of tricks in a player, and I do think Porro is actually the best option. The underlying stats also suggest the same in terms of Porro. So I think if you can spend that sort of money to upgrade, I would go for Porro. But obviously, if you can't afford Porro, then simply just go for Udogie. And I think one Spurs defender would probably be enough. I probably would not be thinking about doubling up on Spurs anytime soon. As far as people who actually still own Matty Cash, I would actually consider holding Matty Cash because ultimately what you're looking for is Game Week 18, Sheffield United at home. And it's very likely right now, in my opinion, that Cash could conceivably play that game. If you still want to save money, though, I can understand, obviously, the Everton defenders have been extremely impressive as of late, so you could also move into them as well. But my only concern with Everton is actually, honestly, the fixtures are still pretty poor for a sort of short run going forwards, right, after this great game here, which is going to be what we have in Game Week 17. So that's my only concern with Everton right now. And moving on to the captaincy for this week, I think because Holland is obviously out of the sort of question, or at least I expect that Holland's out of the question, I think the captaincy is very, very clear cut in that for me, the priority is going to be towards Salah because this is a home game. This is a very good game. United have been a shocking team as of late. And then I would actually put my vice captaincy on Son. Now, obviously, Son was extremely explosive, and we talked about this in terms of our analysis for the season, right? Son is a brilliant vice captaincy option. He is someone who's on penalties, and that is a huge, huge buffer, right? Anytime you get a penalty as a player in FPL, you just know you're probably due for a haul in one of those games. Morgan Gibbs-White, for example, recently got 13 points simply due to, for example, that one pen, one assist game. So you know that's what a penalty taker will possess. But I think obviously when we look at the fixtures, given that Sal's at home, given that United are actually a pretty poor team as well, and obviously so are Nottingham Forest, but it's an away game for Spurs, I would probably like to take Salah there. If Holland was actually back and fully fit and ready to play, obviously he would be my captaincy option. But as things stand, I think for me it's a very clear Salah captaincy and a vice captaincy for Son. So that's it for my Game Week 17 preview. Thank you guys so much for watching. Appreciate you guys for supporting the channel. If you guys can like and subscribe, that'd be absolutely lovely. Do feel free to comment your questions in terms of transfer plans that you have available. One thing I'd also like to recommend is that you could consider rolling, right? Because Game Week 18 is where a lot of things will be in flux. We might want to actually move towards targeting Aston Villa a little bit harder, but they actually have Brentford away in Game Week 17. So actually waiting for Game Week 18 to move and pounce onto those Aston Villa players makes a lot of sense as well. But that's it for the video, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.